Hello, Chris here. In this video we are going to explore what makes for good UVs. And there are three main things you should know. One, the UVs take up as much of the one-to-one space as possible. Two, the UVs have minimal to no distortion. And three, the amount of UV shells for the objects are minimal. So let's go ahead and begin to explore these concepts. So as stated before, the purpose of UVs is to be able to texture our object, right? So we can get away from just a standard like gray material to something else like brick or metal or whatever we want to display our object as. And every 3D object is going to have a material, right? As discussed in the last video, and each material will have 2D textures, and each of those 2D textures will utilize the UVs that we have created for our 3D model. If I go to the UV editor and we examine the one-to-one grid space that we will use for our UVs, we can see that it is perfectly square, and textures are in the power of 2. So if we're thinking of the power of 2, right, we're thinking 128, 256, 512, 1024, 2048, 4096, right? And what we'll be using in the future will be 2048 by 2048. What I mean by that is if I go to Photoshop and I look at a square image, the resolution for this image here is 2048 pixels by 2048 pixels. It's important to understand this because we need to know this in order to be able to optimize our UVs. If I were to take an image that was not square and apply it to a material inside of Maya, it will force it to be square. So it would squish it or distort it in order for it to be square. For example, let's take a look at this brick wall here. Notice that this image is not square. Let's go ahead and apply this to one of our cubes. Alright, here we have applied that image without editing it to the cube. We can see that the bricks are being foreshortened. Let's actually take a look at that in the UV editor. So that entire image, let's pull it up again over here. That entire image is within this one-to-one space, but it has been squished down in this direction in order for it to fit. So it has not been clipped, it has been distorted, and we do not want that. The process that we will use for creating textures will automatically allow us not to have to worry about this, but it is something that you should know, that all textures will be in the power of 2, and we will be utilizing 2048 by 2048 textures. We will be using real-time engines for our models, right? Because we're making models that could go inside of a game engine. Because of this, everything needs to be optimized. So when the game engine has a draw call for a material and a texture, we need to make sure that that memory that is being used is being put to good use. And there are a lot of ways that we're going to do this, but one of the biggest ways is that we're making sure we're using as much of the one-to-one space as possible for our UVs. So here I have that 2048 by 2048 image, right? And if I save it out, here it is, this brick. I've saved this, and I've also saved just a black 2048 by 2048 image. So if I look at this brick and I check out the properties for the brick 2048 by 2048 as well as the just black 2048 by 2048, both of them, right, are the same size. They're 12 megabytes a piece. So it doesn't matter what exactly is on that image, whether it's fully detailed or just a filled image. It's going to take up the same amount of memory. And this concept is important to understand. So if I go back to Maya and I look at these, let's look at these UVs. Let me turn this off. So here's the UV shell for that cube, right? And it is one contiguous shell, meaning that every component is attached, nothing is detached. So if I did want to, for whatever reason, detach something, right, this would be one shell, and this would be another shell, right? And I can move these shells around. Whenever we have a model that is more complex than just a cube, we are going to have multiple shells. And we want those shells to take up as much of this one-to-one space as possible, because if they don't, let's look at the UVs for this model. You'll see that these UVs have been scaled down considerably, right? So that's doing a couple things. One, it's making the texture quite large. These bricks are very large. And two, if this material was only being applied to this object, then this would be very inefficient, because we would be loading in a 2048 by 2048 image when really we could get away with a 1024 by 1024 with the same results. So what would be better would be if, you know, this shell was scaled up to fit inside this one-to-one space without touching the edges as much as possible. And now you can see we're getting a lot better results for the same amount of memory that is being loaded in. Here I have a multicolored 2048 by 2048 image that I have saved out. Let's go into Maya and let's apply that to this cube. Alright, so I've applied it to the cube, and you can see here it is, right? If I move the shell around and see how the UVs are rolling over each of those colors, right? It's important to understand that multiple objects that are not combined can use the same material. And if they're using the same material, they should be using the same one-to-one UV space. So let's say I want all four of these to use the same material, and I want them each to be a different color. So I can go ahead and go to object mode and select all four of these, and you can see now I can see all of their UVs, right? So there's a UV for this one, here's this one, here's this one, and here's this one, right? They're all four. And these are all just the default UVs, right? If I go to, we'll learn how to apply materials and textures in a future video, but I'm just going to go ahead and select all of these and assign the same material. So now they all have the same material. So let's say I want this one to be black, this one to be red, green, and blue. So I can find out which shell is over here. I'm going to scale this down to be black, to fit in the black space. This shell will be the red, so I'll scale this down, fit this in here. This shell will be green, and this shell will be blue. So this is just important because most models should and will have multiple pieces to them, and they'll be sharing the same material. And you will need to manage your UV shells for all of those models into one, a single one-to-one UV space. You could think about an open world game, for example, might have a very large texture sheet for plants, right? And perhaps on that texture sheet there would be a bunch of leaves and bark and like different types of grasses and bushes and textures for all these types of plants. And each one of those models, would have the UVs would be set up appropriately to capture that texture. And then when you brought that model into the game, you would have one material, one draw call that you could apply to all of your plant life in the game, right? So it would be very efficient. It's another way to use materials, which we'll be diving further into materials in a future video. Okay, we also want minimal distortion on our UVs. Distortion, if I look at this cube right here, right, there's no distortion. Everything is appropriately set up. However, if I took maybe an edge like this edge, and this edge, things are moved around. You can see that we're getting a lot of stretching and pulling and distortion on the brick. It doesn't look as it should look. And when you are creating your UVs, you will almost always start off with having a bunch of distortion. And one of the main tasks is getting rid of that distortion. There are multiple ways to do it, but in the end, we want your object to be distortion free. Instead of applying some random like brick texture to check for distortion in the UV editor, there is a very helpful tool, and it is this checkerboard. If I click on this checker map right here, you'll see I get a checker grid. I can control that. I can control the opacity of that grid by clicking on this little mountain icon here and scaling it up or down, or I could click this mountain icon to have the checker map on in the viewport over here, but not on over here. So I tend to like to do something like this. But in this case, our goal is to look and see that the checker map, the squares are actually square, and we're not getting distorted or inverted inside out with the text, the UV1001. If I come over here and I have the checker map on, you can tell very quickly what is wrong with this, right? You can see the distortion. It's quite distinct. So this tool, the checker map, will be what we use primarily to optimize and get rid of and identify distortion. And so just know that you can turn it on here, checker map. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this. So every object will have multiple shells, as mentioned before, right? So if I took some of these and cut them, and now I have a bunch of individual UV shells, which are also just single faces. I could, do something like this. Now I have one shell. So I currently have 5 shells here. And what's useful about this is that there's no distortion in any of these, right? It'd be very easy to not have distortion in these. However, we do have seams. And a seam is wherever there is an edge, like this one. This edge on the model is a shared edge. This polygon face and this polygon face each share this edge. However, the UVs for that edge are split or cut. So the texture is not going to roll over seamlessly across this edge. And you can see that, right? Like the brick is not lined up properly. Same with this edge. Most of these edges are not lined up. The only one that is this one. So you can see that the brick is rolling over appropriately. If I take this shell and move it, you can see that it looks like, you know, it's seamless. However, if we look at all of these, right, we can see they're not lined up at all. You will always have seams in your UVs in order to have no distortion or very little distortion. Your job is to have as little distortion as possible and as few seams as possible. We do not need so many shells for this object because we're not getting distortion when we stitch them back together, right? So I could come in here and stitch them up like this, and yeah, now I'm getting a lot less, a lot fewer seams. I still have quite a bit, but I also have quite a bit that are connected. So in the next video, we'll start learning about how to actually unwrap and create your shells. But just know that you want to have as few shells as well as the minimal amount of distortion.